Right then, so here we are, the first episode of the Working Wellbeing podcast, live from the Health and Wellbeing at Work Conference 2025. There you go, I did it all in one go.
You got it right too, well done.
Yeah, just about. And we are joined by Professor Neil Greenberg. We've not met before, so
No.
it would be great to introduce yourself and tell me a little bit more about you.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, thanks for interviewing me. So I'm a consultant psychiatrist. I'm based primarily at King's College London, but I also run my own company called March on Stress Limited. So I'm kind of here with both hats on. And I served in the military for about 23 years. I was in the Royal Navy and did time as a doctor on ships and submarines and with the Marines. And during that time, I was a doctor, but I became interested in psychiatry, so I specialised in psychiatry. And I was the person who, when I was in the military, was most interested in academic type work. So during my career, I became the Defence Professor of Mental Health and ran the Military Mental Health Research Programme, which was all really interesting. Yeah. But by 2013, I kind of felt that I'd had my fill, and so I left the military at that point. And I carried on working at King's College London and also running my own company. And I see lots of occupational mental health patients. So I'm interested in the interplay between mental health and people's ability to do their job. And kind of that's kind of what I do. And just a bit excitement for the future, I'm also the president-elect of the Society of Occupational Medicine.
Oh,
so I'll take over for that in June. So I'll be the first psychiatrist to do that in 90 years, which is quite exciting.
Wow. Busy then.
Yeah, generally pretty busy.
By the sounds of it, yeah. I always feel in awe of proper psychologists and psychiatrists. I'm a business psychologist, right, which doesn't quite have the same ring to it as a proper psychiatrist, but yeah.
I guess there's some self-esteem work we could do, but maybe for another time.
This should be a therapy session rather than...
Absolutely.
So you are involved with 3 talks, I believe, over the course of this 2 days. So what are they on? What's the subjects?
Yeah, so I've got a couple of talks and then I've got one sort of roundtable chairing session. So I'm speaking today on moral injury and what that is and what you can do about it. Yeah. I'm also then chairing a roundtable session on psychological safety, which is obviously an important concept for keeping staff well at work. And then tomorrow, along with a colleague, Charlotte Hall, I'm speaking on the psychological impact of home and hybrid working. Yeah. And it's actually her PhD, which I supervise. So we'll be doing that together tomorrow.
Love it. Right. I want to hear about all of this. So let's start from the top. Moral injury. What is that? And
yeah, so moral injury has been around the concept's been around for well over 100 years. It mostly originally thought about in the military, and what it describes is the strong emotional reactions that we get when we're put in a situation that clashes with our moral code. So I know that sounds a bit complex, but basically these are the sort of situations where we say it should never have happened. So for instance, back in COVID, if you were an intensive care nurse, before COVID, you've been used to dealing with really sick patients. That's what you do in intensive care. You deal with one patient and, you do your best. And sadly, some of those patients sometimes died. But you know that, you did your best for them, that these things happen. During COVID, you might have 6 patients at the same time. You're trying to give them really good care. But unfortunately, if you've got 6 patients and there's 2 alarms going off, which alarm do you go to? What's the right thing to do? And many nurses would have said, we should never have been asked to do that, which is understandable. And so these morally injurious situations are ones that really clash with what our sense of right and wrong is. And it's really hard for us to make sense of them. Yeah. And that can lead to people having, a great degree of distress.
Got you. So does this affect people only when they're working in almost like a life and death? You mentioned the military, you mentioned people working in intensive care, or does this affect people in all lines of work?
So it can affect anybody, for sure. And actually, just in terms of kind of these critical type events, the evidence is that probably somewhere between half and 3/4 of us will have a traumatic critical event at some point in our lives. Right. Clearly, if you're in the police force or the military, it's more likely. But most of us, if we're walking down the street, occasionally there are road accidents, occasionally there are big fires. So trauma is actually pretty common. It's more common to experience it than not. Mm-hmm. And the 3 ways that you can experience a moral injury are through what we call acts of commission. So they are things that you or other people have done. That should never happen. He or she shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have done it. Acts of omission. So you people standing by, I just let it happen. I didn't intervene. I should have done something. And then feelings of betrayal, feeling let down by people who should have had our back. Our bosses, if I'm having a tough time and my boss says, oh, yeah, well, I'm busy myself, just get on with it. That's not what my boss should do. No. And so those 3 situations can really affect anybody.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's the effect of that, and what's the treatment of it?
So it's important to recognize that it's not a mental health condition. It's not like depression or post-traumatic stress disorder. It's much more akin to what might have been termed burnout. You probably heard the term burnout. So it's what we call in a medical sense, it's a syndrome. So it's a collection of symptoms. It's not a diagnosis. But it's important because it's linked with depression, it's linked with PTSD, and it's also linked with suicidality, which clearly is important. So what can we do about it? Well, the key thing is to try and help people prepare for these events. So if you are an intensive care nurse, if you're an emergency service worker, these situations are going to happen.
Right.
And so we need to make sure that you thought about it before the time that it happens, and you've kind of got your head around, what you might do and what the impact is. Once they do happen, then we need to try and help people who have been exposed to these potentially morally injurious events to try and make sense of them, to try and see that actually, although it appears to be complex and nonsensical, that actually there is some meaning. So, like when there's a big disaster and there's a building collapse and many people have died, and on day 3 they pull out a 7-year-old, and they save this 7-year-old, and that's fantastic. The other 289 people who are dead, we don't talk about so much, but saving this 7-year-old is really, really important, which of course it is.
Yeah.
And so it's trying to find that, when these horrible things happen, that sometimes good things can come out of it. And sometimes it's just happens. It's not anyone's fault. It's not your fault. It's not the manager's fault. So it's about developing what we try and call a meaningful narrative, which is a story where it's not your fault. It's not anyone else's fault. People tried their best, but unfortunately these things happen.
Yeah. That's super interesting, preparing people for it. I came across something recently where I was talking about realistic job previews and how far they should go. That you could potentially go over the line where it becomes, this is just a terrible job. And then, number one, why would anybody do it if you're giving a fully realistic preview? And then the other thing that comes into it is, does that err on the side of almost coming across too negative, or we're preempting bad things happening? But like you say, if you're working in a space where that's not an inevitability, but it's a real possibility, then you need to give that preview, right?
You absolutely do. So, a good example of that is resuscitation training. So most of us, if you've done resuscitation training, you have a resusciani, and, you give your saving breaths, you give some cardiac compressions, you do it for the right amount of time, and your instructor goes, well done, Neil, resusciani lives. Well, I don't know if you know, but actually, if you have an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, 90% of people in those situations die no matter what you do.
Wow.
So even if you do your best resuscitation, you do exactly as you've been trained, chances are the poor patient is going to die. And you're going to feel terrible because you've been trained that if you do it right, you're going to save their life. So really, during the training, you should do all the right things. The instructor says, great, done really well, but unfortunately, the patient's died. And so I've kind of got a bit of a personal campaign, which sounds really bad, but hopefully it's not, is that resusciani needs to die. And, she needs to die regularly because that's realistic. And if you can change your mindset, from I'm going to save a life, to this person's dead, there's just a glimmer of a chance I might bring them back. It's a different mindset. And so we need to train people for realism. If you're a doctor these days, or you're a nurse, or really any healthcare professional, you've got to expect that people are going to make complaints. It's really horrible. You get investigated, everyone calls into question what you've done, but it's going to happen. So if we don't prepare healthcare professionals as they do their training, if we don't prepare them for that, then it's going to be really impactful. But if you say, do you know what, this is a unfortunate side effect of being a healthcare professional in the modern world, let's prepare for it. Most complaints, don't come to anything, it'd be difficult. And at least you've begun to think about it in a realistic manner.
Yes. My mind immediately goes to, with the business psychologist side of my head, goes to how this would relate to like a corporate job, for example. And there must be some moral injury that can come as a result of that, I would have thought, or certainly semi-traumatic experiences that people would have. But then also this probably brings us into the realm of psychological safety, which is the other thing that you're talking about. So I guess in the workplace, in addition to some of the things that you've spoken about there, it's getting people to just talk up more often, right? And share these things and be more vulnerable.
Yeah, it is preparing people. And you mentioned it's a good point. You don't want to prepare them for the absolute 1 in a million chance thing that's going to happen and put them off. But at the same time, you don't want to say, it'll all be great, just come along, everyone will love the job. So in a business sense, to create psychological safety, there has to be a collective sense of what you're doing and why you're doing it. And I think it's fair that some of your bosses in your life might be really easygoing and others might be really meticulous. It doesn't mean the meticulous boss is a bully. They're entitled to try and get good results. They're not entitled to throw things at you and call you stupid names. Clearly not. But not everybody is going to have the same attitude towards life as you might have. And actually, many of us who go through those difficult experiences, difficult bosses, come out and say, do you know what? Actually, they really pushed me to do a better job. And actually, I can see their point of view. We made more money. We were more successful. We delivered better care, whatever that might be. The alternative is everyone says everything's okay all the time. It doesn't matter if it works. Well, that's nice in a kind of general sense, but it doesn't help the world progress, and it doesn't help individuals progress. And I think allied to this, there's this concept. It's to do with trauma, but I think it also works well with moral injury, which is called post-traumatic growth. And so what we know is many people who get involved in disasters or traumas, it is difficult at first, but when they come through it, they go, do you know what? If I can cope with that, then I can pretty much cope with anything. We've done lots of work at the King Centre for Military Health Research on military personnel, who routinely deploy for 6 months or even longer to war zones. They see difficult things, and it's not easy at times. And you would think that actually many people who do that would come out broken, with post-traumatic stress disorder, alcohol, the like. Those things do happen. They're not very common, nowhere near as common as the Daily Mail would have us believe, but they do happen. But the most common outcome after a really difficult 6 months in a operational environment is people come out and say, I feel stronger. I'm really proud of what I did. I managed to survive and do well in that difficult environment. Yeah. So when we do have hard times, as long as they're not illegal, discriminatory, I mean, those things should not happen. When we do have hard times, we often learn a lot, and we probably learn more that way than having someone who just says, oh, do whatever you want. So we need to keep that balance. And that's about preparing people, from a psychological safety point of view, that it's okay to say I'm finding it tough, because that's okay. And a boss is okay to say it is tough, but here's the reasons why, and here's what we're going to do about it.
Yes. And you're talking about psychological safety today in the context of creating an inclusive environment as well. So I found that quite interesting. So you think that you've just described there is a predictor of an inclusive environment, right?
Absolutely. So I'm chairing a round table session on that, but that's similar stuff. So the key point there is that we need to have a psychologically safe environment where it's okay for a boss to say, the next 2 or 3 weeks are going to be really tough. We really need to do this. The business needs you to perform at a really high level. You can't do that for 4 years, but you absolutely can do it for, some weeks, maybe a month, maybe 2 months, who knows? And it's okay for an employee to say, okay, boss, I'm going to try my best. And then week 2, do you know what? This is just too much for me. And in the old way of thinking, we wanted people to do the job. We wanted them, a big list of here's 17 tasks you must do for your job. A much better way of thinking about things is how do we fit the job to the person in front of us? So you're very good at looking at numbers and meticulously good at numbers, but you're not very good at meeting customers and having, a cup of coffee with them. Why force someone to have a cup of coffee as part of their job? Why not give them the jobs that fit them? Yeah. And so a good manager should be adapting the work available to the people they have, not saying everyone's got to do this because that's what's on the list.
But where is the line? So I've come across, there's been a couple of job descriptions, job adverts that have kind of blown up on social media recently, where they give a very realistic job preview of almost, this is an incredibly stressful job. You will probably be burnt out. You will receive 10,000 emails a day, this sort of thing. And there's a point where you're reading those where you're like, oh, that's good that they're giving a realistic view of it. But then the other part of your head says, well, fix the job. Fix the job. If it's that hard, make it less hard.
Yeah, well, I mean, burnout is always a bad outcome. No one wins through burnout. But, the fact that things are pressured doesn't mean it's necessarily going to burn you out. So I think the thing there is, if it's a new job and it hasn't been done before, there's a risk, isn't there, that job description is not realistic. No one could do it. But actually, if you've had 25 people in that job, half of them have found it difficult because it is a difficult job. The other half have done really well. They've moved on and they've progressed, and now they're a managing partner or director. Who knows what they're doing? So then actually what you're telling people is this isn't easy. If you want to try something difficult, then come and try this. But if you don't, that's okay. Go somewhere else. I guess if you were advertising the job as for an Olympian, you want to be a gold medal winner. It's not going to say you have to do a couple of runs a day and try and eat healthily if you can. It's going to say you need to put everything else in your life aside, everything, in order to focus on that 10 seconds for your 100-meter sprint or whatever. And that's realistic. And if you don't do that, you're not going to win. So don't apply for the job. So I think it's okay to be honest. It's not But of course, if no one can do the job, if a job says, I want you to fly a plane blindfolded with your hands tied behind your back, then that's not realistic. So I think people should be given the right information to make informed decisions, and then they choose whether they take it or not.
It's really interesting the way you talk about this subject and the link to inclusion because, and I'm going to get this wrong, I'm not going to be able to articulate this correctly, but I'll try it anyway. But when you look at the whole kind of inclusion, diversity agenda, there is a risk that sometimes people think it's verging on the on soft and fluffy and a bit too touchy-feely, and that actually, people use, I can't believe I'm saying this word, woke, it's part of this woke thing and everyone's offended by everything. But the way that you're talking about it is that actually if we create an environment where people can speak honestly about some of the hazards and the pressures that they'll be faced with, then there's a link to resilience there and there's a link to coping. You're not talking about soft and fluffy things here, right?
No, it's not. Well, it's not soft and fluffy. It's trying to fit the person's skill set and their attitudes and their desires to the available jobs. We need to earn money, we need to live, but we don't have to do it all the same way. When I was in the military, I did lots of things as a psychiatrist, but one of the things you used to do is to see relatively junior people who might not fit with the military way of life, because it's not for everybody, and you can't really know all about it when you join up. You've heard the recruitment sort of material, you've done the basic training, which is all very structured, but then you get to your first unit, you've then got to do the job for real, and sometimes people don't fit in. But in the military, once you've served 6 months, you can't leave until you've done 4 years. You are trapped for that initial 4 years, and that can be really difficult, both for the individual who thinks I think I made a mistake, and also for the military who says I've got this person who really can't do the job. And so one of the things we would do as psychiatrists is to talk to people and decide whether they were temperamentally unsuitable. So we're not saying there's anything wrong with them, but we're saying now we've had a bit of a good look, this person doesn't really fit. And we often described it as being a square peg in a round hole. It doesn't mean square pegs are wrong. It just, the round hole you happen to be in is not the place you need to be. And so as a psychiatrist, you would say they're not depressed, they're not otherwise unwell. They just don't fit. And then that would allow the individual in the military to say, look, let's just cut our losses and leave. And I think there is something about that in other jobs. You can't know everything about what a job's going to be like from even the best description. But what we know is that the more realistic the information is you're given and the more realistic the training is that you have, the more likely it is you'll be able to cope when you finally get there.
Got you. So I'm going to try and link that to hybrid working somehow. A bit of a left turn there from trauma and, post-traumatic growth, which is a really interesting concept, to hybrid working. So I guess there's aspects of that, in terms of the realistic job preview, people working in different ways. So in terms of where you're looking at today around hybrid working, what's the angle there?
But again, I think it very much fits around, is this job the right job for the person? And of course, our needs and wants change throughout our life. When we're 19 and going into our first job for the first time, maybe working from home on a computer, not seeing anybody physically for weeks upon end, maybe that might not be the right job. I think it will be for some people, but it might not be for most people. But in your mid-30s or 40s, you might have some young kids, you might have, other responsibilities. And actually, you know who your colleagues are, you know what you're doing. Maybe you only really, for a social reason, need to go in once a week or once a month or whatever it might be. So I do think it is the same thing. I can feel okay in this environment to do my work, but it has to suit me.
Yeah.
And I think that the challenging thing is, before, you'll hear if you come to the talk tomorrow, but before COVID, although there was home working and hybrid working, it was quite uncommon, and people who did it often had skill sets which were very suited to doing that, working on computers, and actually maybe the company didn't really have much of an office space. But during COVID, people were forced to homework, and that was a strange environment. Most of us were forced to stay at home. Now we've kind of moved, hopefully, into home working version 2, where actually it's much more common. But it's important that we don't tell people they must come into the office when actually there's no reason, because a computer could be at home. But it's also important that we don't just say stay at home and we forget about you. And one of the findings we'll talk about tomorrow is people who do homework a lot. One of the things they fear is that they're missing out, that everyone at work's getting promoted and doing well, and actually they're getting their crappy jobs and not getting promoted. And that organizations need to, value people no matter where they're working. I think that is a challenge, but it's achievable.
Yeah, absolutely. So are you So are you pro or anti return to work mandates? Where do you stand on that?
I think I mean in a general sense I'm not pro anything that you mandate just because you mandate it. There has to be a rationale for it. So if it's an organization that really doesn't fit well with home working, maybe a very social one, maybe you need, then actually I don't think you should say, well, stay at home and do a less good job because you're not in the wrong environment. But this idea that you must have people 5 days a week at work when actually there's no reason for that, or no obvious reason, I don't agree with that either. What is clear is if you look at can people work effectively from home, I think the overwhelming answer is yes, they can, and in many cases more effectively, because you don't take time off. But it does depend on the job. You can't really home work as a neurosurgeon. It's a bit challenging, or as a plumber, I guess that's difficult. But certainly, for many jobs where there is an element of work on computers and networking and teams, why couldn't you be anywhere really?
Yeah. I've done quite a lot of thinking about hybrid working. So I'm a home worker. I work almost exclusively from home unless I'm on a client site. And I love it, and I wouldn't have it any other way now. But I think back to an earlier version of myself when I first came into the workplace, and I think I've found that much more difficult. And the one thing that I always think about is just the importance of empathizing with people in different positions from yourself. And I sometimes come across that lack of empathy from, I want to work from home, so therefore everyone else should love it. And I think a big part of this, I don't know whether you agree, is that we should just be empathizing with somebody else's position and time of life, skills, job person fit, whatever it might be.
Yeah, I mean, so from a mental health and legal point of view, there is the disability legislation. So if you have a disability under the law, under the Equality Act, then your employer has a duty to make reasonable adjustments. They have a duty. But the reality is every good employer is making reasonable adjustments, whether someone's disabled or not. Why on earth wouldn't you try and help someone who's got a washing machine being delivered at 3 o'clock? Why would you make them take a day's leave when they can work perfectly well at home, and they're going to interrupt themselves for 10 minutes to let the people in and 10 minutes to let them out, which is their lunch break? No one loses in that. And all you do is create goodwill, and hopefully the employee works harder. So I think a good employer is making reasonable adjustments anyway. And part of that for many of us is about home or hybrid working.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think that some managers find it difficult because they lose that, sense of control? Not that they're controlling people, but, they can't see what somebody's doing all of the time. So therefore, it reflects badly on them somewhat.
I think there is a bit of fear, and there's also a large training or information giving perspective. So during COVID, because the nature of my work, I had lots and lots of conversations and lectures I gave, virtually to organizations. And what I heard from managers all the time was, it's really difficult to manage people remotely. I don't know how I'm doing it. And that was because it was forced on them and forced on the employee. I hear that much less now. And I think managers, are happy to do a 15-minute Teams call with someone and have a chat. And actually the purpose is having a chat. Whereas before you'd probably do that, around the office, you'd catch them, or before a meeting or after a meeting. So I think we have adapted, but I also think there are information and there's training that you can give managers to help them do that job better. And one of the things, of course, managers worry about is if they can't see someone, how do I know they're doing their job? But actually, if we think more about what's the output I want, why am I that bothered whether someone's working 7 hours a day if I get the 4 tasks I've done, and it's to a good quality? So I do think our mindset sometimes is very much production line, stamping things on a piece of tin or moving this bit from A to B. That still goes on in some places, but actually most of us now are more required to use our brain and to produce output. And I think a good manager has to trust people, but also not let people take the mick. There has to be this balance. And as long as you and your employee are on the same page, I think the way you achieve the task is down to whatever works best.
It's communication, isn't it? I've run sessions, spoke to individuals in the past, and they've talked to me about a sense of guilt when they go and put the washing in the washing machine because they're away from. And what if my Teams goes to away rather, rather than saying that they're online and somebody will be watching it? And I always kind of ask them the question: do you notice when your colleagues are away? And they're like, well, no, because I'm not looking for it. And it's like, well, they're probably not looking for you either. If you just communicate that and have those conversations, it would dispel some of that fear or some of that guilt. But
it's also what people are used to. So when I was in the military, when I worked in a military setting on a military base, it was routine that at lunchtime, which would last an hour and a half, you would do an hour of physical exercise. So that was the time you go for a run together, then you'd eat a bit of food and carry on. I then moved to work in a NHS setting to do some more of my training. And at lunchtime, I said, I'm going for a run. And everyone went, what are you doing? You can't, where will you be? I don't know, somewhere about 30 minutes away. And I'll come back. And everyone just thought it was really weird and strange. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was entitled to my hour for lunch and I was back in time. But it was about mindsets, because that's not how they were brought up. It's not how what was usual. And that it doesn't mean that either way is right or wrong.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. And that's what COVID did, right? It took away all of these cues that we have in our environment that we're used to, and we had to find a new way of working. And be more conscious about it as well. As you mentioned before, those things that you wouldn't need to think about. I'm just going to bump into somebody and I'll spot them. If they're not looking that well, I can say, how are you doing? Or I can find out about their home life. But you've got to consciously make that happen when you're working remotely.
I agree. I think from an academic point of view, as a professor, I'm interested in what does the data tell us, because sometimes we can all have a good story, but a good story doesn't always tell the overall truth. And one of the difficulties with what we learned during COVID is, as well as people being forced to work from home, they were also in the middle of a major crisis which affected people's health, and there were people dying. And so it would be a much better way, and I hope it doesn't happen, is if there were mass rail, bus and travel strikes and all the roads were blocked by, oil protesters. And so we had to work from home just because you couldn't move. That would be a much better way, because there's nothing bad going on. It'll get sorted at some point. And so we have to be very careful of not extrapolating too much from COVID and forgetting there is a health crisis going on, as well as a home working crisis.
Oh, that's really interesting. I'm out of time, but I wish I could ask you more about it. When you said the data, my ears picked up. I was like, I want to know about this. But yes, I will have to interview you again in the future and find out even more about that. So, final thing I want to ask you is kind of, where can people find you? You mentioned that you own your own company, right? March on Stress.
Yep.
You've got your own conference as well, right?
We have, yeah, indeed. Yeah, well, yeah, absolutely.
When's that coming up?
That is on the 1st of April. Tickets selling fast. There's still some places left. Yeah, so that's in London, again, on the concept of home and work together.
Awesome. And where can people find you? Is it?
So I'll be around. If you look at the schedule, you'll see my name pop up. So you'll find me in those places. I can't quite remember where I'm talking, but I will know by the time that comes up. Or if you look on marchonstress.com, then you'll find all our contact details. Very happy to have a chat.
Perfect. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Really appreciate it. And hopefully see you on a future one.
Absolutely. Nice chatting. Take care. Bye now.
Cheers.
Bye.